bailout does is kick the can down the road. So despite the fact that Paulson, the Treasury Secretary, has said that he's very happy to have not passed this forward, it's such a large series of commitments were made on Sunday, and they're so ambiguous that this is going to be an issue going forward as more money is spent and more actions are required deep into the next administration.
So what do you mean McCain people weren't there?
As far as the story that I heard, both parties were invited, but McCain's people were unable to attend.
I wanted to go to a comment of Sarah Palin. She's, of course, the Republican vice presidential nominee, made what's being called her first major campaign gaffe Saturday when she claimed Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac have become too big and too expensive for taxpayers. She was speaking before the government bailout.
John McCain has been calling for years to reform things and cut bureaucracy, even at the lending agencies that our government supports. The fact is that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, they've gotten too big and too expensive to the taxpayers.
Your response to what Governor Palin said?
I'd say that if she waited another 6 months, she might have been right, or at least another few days. But so far, they haven't actually been just expensive to taxpayers. And even if they were, they wouldn't be the only thing that's expensive to taxpayers. And so it would be more interesting to hear her say this if she was opposed to N number of other things on which we're busy spending, like the war in Iraq and other things.
But the taxpayers aren't footing the bill until now, until this announcement.
Now they're going to. And by the way, her campaign officially likes the idea of the taxpayers taking on $200 to $500 billion in risk liability, and they're going to spend. The U.S. government's going to.
What do you mean they like it?
The U.S. taxpayers are going to spend somewhere between $100 and $300 billion before this is all over with this new arrangement where they bring Fannie and Freddie under their wing and assume the debts. So her campaign, her included, officially like this bailout, quote-unquote bailout, which suddenly makes the taxpayers pay for Fannie and Freddie, which they hadn't before. So she thinks in the past that Fannie and Freddie were a burden. They weren't. But she thinks making them a burden to the taxpayer in the future is a great idea because she and her campaign endorse making them a burden, even though they didn't used to be.
How did it come to this?
Well, I mean, a lot of things. I think it's a watershed moment that nobody wants to talk about, but the single biggest reason that the Treasury moved now and that Fannie and Freddie are now under conservatorship and no longer independent is that foreign central banks and foreign investors started to sell off their debt that they bought from Fannie and Freddie. And we watched this for the last 3 or 4 months, those of us who watched this. Foreign interests, particularly foreign central banks in East Asia and the Middle East, own $1.4 trillion worth of instruments, debt, backed by Fannie and Freddie, and they began to sell it off.
Why?
Because it's simply too risky. Owning large amounts of mortgage bonds in U.S. dollars with a falling dollar, it's reversed lately, but generally speaking, a falling dollar over many years of an unknown credit quality is just not desirable. And I think some of them are politically worried that they're going to have to go back to their general public and tell them, okay, I'm sorry, folks, we lost hundreds or tens of billions of dollars supporting the American middle class while not supporting you. The flip side of that, which I think no one's mentioned, which is pretty interesting, is that the federal government is going to be in the business now of making sure to collect home mortgage payments from Americans who are not doing so well and take that money and give it to investors who they just bailed out, and take that money and give it to foreign investors who they just bailed out. So the U.S. government is going to take over some of the collection agency duties otherwise done by banks and other intermediaries, and help make that money available to affluent investors and foreign investors.
How does the bailout contradict Bush's so-called free market policies?
I mean, we're watching the death of the free market ideology. It hasn't been announced, but increasingly the policies, the way we talk, the way we make legislation, all but formally abandons the notion that the market can do it right, the government will do it wrong, and that government intervention is a bad idea. It turns out that government intervention is a bad idea unless you want and need money from the government, in which case it becomes a fine idea and bring on the government cash. So it might be unfortunate when somebody who's having a tough time in their life wants a free piece of cheese, but when a bunch of executives want a free $100 billion, it turns out that's the kind of government intervention we can all get behind, we can all believe in.
Where is the government intervention on behalf of struggling homeowners?
It's pretty meek. The Treasury, the same group that did the takeover of Fannie and Freddie, has set up meetings with various creditors and has pressured banks and creditors to renegotiate and to be more flexible and more, quote-unquote, understanding, to allow homeowners in distress, if they meet certain criteria, to renegotiate their loans and to get temporary protection from foreclosure. But basically, the approach we've had from the federal government to helping homeowners has been to help the banks and the bankers and hope and pressure them to pass that help along. And just to give you an idea of how stunningly successful that was, in the second quarter, the second 3-month period of 2008, 500,000 U.S. houses were either in foreclosure or entering foreclosure. So 500,000 households slipped through the cracks in the 3-month period. One can get the idea that this is not exactly airtight, this method of help.
Max Fraad Wolff, I want to thank you for being with us. Economist, writer, instructor at the Graduate Program in International Affairs at New School University, writes for Huffington Post, Asia Times, and The Independent here in New York. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. We will look at the church of the vice presidential nominee, Sarah Palin, in a minute.
The best thing